get straight into it. Lachlan Morton. Two massive but really different feats recently. Winning Unbound Gravel and then that record-breaking solo lap of Australia.
Yeah.
What can we actually pull from these? Things you can use.
Exactly. And we've got, direct insights here, Lachlan's own reflections. So our goal isn't just to tell the story again.
Well,
It's to really dissect the principles underneath. Performance, sure, but also mental grit and maybe surprisingly how going back to basics can work even now.
okay, let's start with the lap of Australia. 14,200 kilometers, solo. What were the absolute core drivers? I mean, for something that huge.
This wasn't just like putting a pin in a map for a record.
Right.
There was this really strong pull to reconnect with his first experiences cycling in Australia, specifically involving his wife and his very first coach.
Oh.
And the ride itself, it started and ended in Port Macquarie, where he trained as a kid. So that gave it this layer of meaning, real personal closure. That seemed to be a massive fuel source.
Forget endurance as a concept for a sec. What about the specific physical challenge? Like day after day, over 450 kilometers for a month. What stood out there?
The surprising thing he highlighted, actually, was how relentless the flat terrain was.
Really flat.
Counterintuitive, maybe, but unlike, say, hilly races where you get these natural little micro breaks going up and down, this Australian landscape meant just constant, unbroken pedaling, hour after hour. And that creates this unique buildup of strain, a different kind of exhaustion than you might get from, lots of climbing.
Okay, so with that kind of physical grind, the mental side must have been immense. What were the big mental hurdles on those long, featureless days?
Lachlan's pretty open about the mental battle, especially those first few hours each morning, often in the dark. You're dealing with the leftover soreness from the day before, and then facing another massive day alone. Just getting going required huge discipline. He specifically calls out that first hour as like a consistent daily wall to push through.
There was a point he considered stopping, wasn't
Yeah.
there? It really shows how close to the edge these things are. What happened?
He talks about some really close calls with road trains, those huge trucks out on the Nullarbor Plain. So it wasn't just being tired physically or mentally. These were like genuine threats to his life. And that prompted some serious thoughts about just pulling the plug.
So what kept him going through that?
It seems like the underlying purpose, the fundraising, played a big part. Raising money for the Indigenous Literacy Foundation. That gave him something beyond just himself.
Right, let's touch on that. Over $150,000 raised. That's significant. What's the foundation about?
Their focus is on getting literacy resources, including books in First Nations languages, to kids in remote Indigenous communities across Australia. So a very clear, tangible cause. And linking his massive physical effort to that kind of positive outcome, that seems to have provided this really powerful extra layer of motivation when things got incredibly tough.
Okay, let's pivot completely. Unbound Gravel, the unofficial gravel world champs. Big deal. And he won it. And there's a hyper-competitive scene. What's his view on gravel now that kind of informs this win?
Well, what's fascinating is his take on how gravel racing has evolved. He sees it moving much closer to road racing, more optimized, more intense.
Like the stuff he moved away from.
Exactly. That's a style he'd consciously step back from. He found more enjoyment in, say, the Lifetime Grand Prix series, which felt a bit different, less pressure maybe.
So going into Unbound, his head wasn't in that, every watt counts super focused zone.
That's what he says. He describes actually questioning if he even wanted to race much anymore, took a holiday just before. His mindset, he says, was basically just ride without worrying too much about the outcome.
That's pressure.
Reducing that mental load seems key. But interestingly, he did mention having this special feeling on the start line, so maybe some underlying sense of being ready despite the relaxed buildup.
That's interesting, the contrast. Back to basics, mentally maybe, but then he shows up in an Aero skin suit and helmet. How does that fit with the less obsessive approach?
That's a great point, a key nuance. His training might not have been hyper-dialed, but he was still pragmatic about race day. The aero gear shows he's willing to use real performance advantages when it matters. It's like even if you resisted those trends before, you kind of have to acknowledge they make a difference in a stacked field like Unbound. He sort of jokes about it. It's about using those marginal gains strategically, right? Not rejecting performance, just being selective.
Makes sense. So the finish against Chad Haga sounds like it was super tactical. Can you break down how he managed that win in the last few kilometers?
Right, so Haga attacks with about 5K to go, catches Lachlan a bit by surprise, but Lachlan gets back on. Then Haga goes again on a short climb near the finish, clearly trying to get away, avoid a sprint. Lachlan manages to counter that and actually opens a small gap himself.
Right.
Now here's the clever bit. Lachlan knows the finish. It's slightly downhill into the final straight, which can be deceptive. So he deliberately eases up a bit, makes it look like he's maybe struggling.
Playing possum.
Kind of. He thinks this baited Haga into launching his sprint maybe a fraction too early. Lachlan then jumps straight onto his wheel, gets the draft, and then kicks past for the win. It was pretty calculated, using course knowledge, reading his rival.
And winning this huge race, it doesn't seem to have changed his whole outlook on cycling. He's not suddenly chasing wins everywhere.
No, exactly. He seems to see Unbound more as validation, proof that his way of doing things can still get top results. But it's not suddenly his main goal. His core drive still seems rooted in those personal challenges, the inherent satisfaction of riding itself, which you see in him going back to these big solo efforts.
So if we connect these two, right, the solo Australia epic and the intense Unbound race, they seem worlds apart. What's the common thread?
Well, the contrast is stark, definitely. Solo self-reliance versus, pack tactics and competition, totally different physical stresses. And yet the thing that seems consistent is this deep, almost intrinsic connection to just riding the bike. That internal fire seems to fuel him whether he's alone in the outback or in a peloton.
And this back to basics idea we mentioned, how did that actually play out differently in each case? It wasn't the same formula, was it?
No, not at all. For the Australia lap, back to basics felt more about tapping into really fundamental stuff. Personal history, connection to place, riding for a clear purpose beyond himself, the core reasons why someone endures.
Okay.
Whereas for Unbound, back to basics seemed more about stripping away the mental clutter, less focus on constant optimization, trusting his base fitness, and maybe rediscovering some of the simple enjoyment of racing, which, ironically, seemed to unlock that peak performance.
So distilling all this down, what are the key takeaways here, the actionable bits for someone listening who wants to push their own limits, maybe in sports, maybe somewhere else?
Well, first, you really see the power of that intrinsic motivation. Why are you really doing it? That seems crucial for the extreme stuff. Second, the need for adaptability. Different challenges need different approaches, mentally and physically. And third, maybe the most counterintuitive point, is that sometimes a less obsessive, more intuitive approach might actually be more effective than just grinding away at optimization all the time. Even in these really data-heavy pursuits, those fundamentals matter hugely.